intimate there.
You're listening to Head South Radio with your host, Kat Meyer, a podcast dedicated to prioritizing pleasure and removing the stigma and shame around sex. We're here to be curious and have an open conversation about sexual health and relational wellness. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. The information discussed is not a substitute for professional medical advice.
Hi everyone, I'm your host Kat Meyer, and on this episode I am joined by my friend Kumi Sawyers. Kumi is a yoga teacher, massage therapist, nutritionist, and holistic health expert based in California. Our conversation covers a number of topics from understanding pleasure and exploring sexuality to trauma and shame around sex, communicating boundaries, and then we move into birth, new motherhood, the body and sexuality postpartum, and intimacy with your partner while parenting. I am so grateful to Kumi for her vulnerability in sharing her personal experiences as a new mother, as well as her knowledge as a professional. So whether you're pregnant, a new parent, a partner, a friend, or have friends or family members with young children, this episode may be of interest to you. If you don't have kids like myself, I found by hearing Kumi's story and her experience, I have a deeper understanding for the people in my life who do have babies and are currently navigating their relationships with their partners and their own bodies. So beyond connecting to a story based on your history, it's really wonderful to expand one's perspective by listening to an experience you may never have. As always, we start with a quick meditation. I hope you enjoy. Settle in, ground down, root into your sit bones, and start to lengthen through your spine, finding a little integrity by stacking each vertebra, and then starting to notice where your shoulders are and allowing them to draw away or melt away from the ears, letting the elbows be heavy. Tune into your breath, tuning into the quality of your thoughts in this moment. Just taking the next few cycles of breath to set an intention for this conversation, to allow us to share our experiences, connect, and then from this connection, from this conversation, may the people listening relate and understand or have more insight into their own experiences. And then when you're ready, you can start to blink your eyes open, taking in this space. Hi, Kumi.
Hi, Kat.
I'm really excited because this is the first time I'm recording in person.
Oh, cool.
So all of my other previous podcast recordings have been on Zoom or on Zencaster, so this is exciting to be in your space. And so to get started, I would love to share how I know you. I met you through actually hair.
Yeah.
And then through yoga. And what I love about you is that you're someone who has come into my life in very interesting, like I've sought out your class through some dark days in the world or in times when people were scared. So during the pandemic lockdown, you were the first teacher I took a class with on Zoom. And I just remember feeling that sense of safety that you were able to project into the ether of the internet and like hold space for people. And everyone was really scared. And it was like literally the first time I think Love was hosting a Zoom class, and it was your class. And I just remember being in that practice and feeling so safe and held and uncertain, just in panic mode. And so it was just such a lovely experience. And I've had many times, I've taken many of your classes, but there's been some big classes where I was seeking out something, some kind of grounding and holding. And you are someone who's so special and can do that, whether it's in person in Ireland or, on the internet and on Zooms. You really do. Your voice holds people in a way that's like very different from anyone else. So
thank you. That means a lot to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
But I would love for you to introduce yourself, explain to the audience and the listeners who you are, where you're from, where you live now, and the work you do and the people that you work with. And then we'll jump in.
That's always a big question. Who am I? So I'm Kumi Sawyers. I'm a yoga teacher and a massage therapist and really just like a holistic health coach, counselor. I kind of just see the world or see health through a lens of many things. Mm-hmm. But really, I work with people and I work with creating a deeper connection or helping people create a deeper connection to themselves through self-awareness, observation, noticing patterns. Mm-hmm. I feel like I've spent the past 20 years observing people and the patterns that they have created in their lives, how they affect their mental health, their physical health, their emotional health, and really watching people's bodies and where do they store these emotions, this trauma, but also seeing like, oh, where is the life? Where's the joy? Like, where's the flow? And just working in ways to help people organize all of it. So ultimately we are functioning, happy, healthy humans that are able to experience a whole range of emotions.
And so the reason I sought you out for this conversation is because you're someone who works in all of those, the physical body. You work with people and coach people and communicate with people about some of their mental health, their energetic being as well through yoga work and massage therapy. And then you also have a nutritional background. And so what I've been learning over the course of almost 2 years now through Head South and exploring and researching is that we don't talk enough about our sexual health and sexual well-being, but it's something that taps into our physical, energetic, emotional, mental state, all of the other things that people are working on under the umbrella of wellness. Sexual health is kind of last, but it's part of us holistically. And so you're someone who I would love to jump into the conversation about how do we create a lifestyle that allows for pleasure. Because I think a lot of us, regardless of where we grew up or what the cultural experience we have, a lot of people don't know how to experience pleasure or communicate about it or create a lifestyle that allows for giving ourselves permission to experience pleasure.
Yeah. Again, that's a big one. So pleasure is personal. And I think a lot of pleasure can be shrouded in shame. And that really comes back to like childhood stuff, especially when it comes to sexuality. And that is very much a cultural thing in society. So I think, number one, when it comes to pleasure, we have to see personally, like, what in my life brings me pleasure and what is my feeling around that? Like, is that pleasure come from like something that I'm doing that's a secret, or is that pleasure come from something that, is actually making me feel joy? Like, we have all these different associations with pleasure. So I think it's like figuring out first, without any judgment attached, what brings me pleasure? And I think that's really ultimately the thing. And then, we take it from there.
So how would you define, like, pleasure is individual, but how do you define pleasure? Like, what is that experience?
Pleasure is something that makes me feel good. I really think that is like the most simple form of like, what is pleasure? It makes me feel good.
And so, yeah, that doesn't have to be what brings you pleasure in the bedroom. What you're saying is like, you can explore in just like the foods that you like to eat or the people that you like to be in communication and community with, the way that you move your body. Because some people love to move their body like yourself in dance, expression and movement. And some people like it when they're sitting and still or running or climbing rocks, and discovering what pleasure means in all of these different forms. Of like, in your physical body, in your mental, like some people love to be stimulated by deep conversations or intellectual conversations. And what turns you on?
What turns you on? Yeah. And I think that the more we begin to notice in ourselves what turns us on, what makes us feel good, we then begin to have this memory bank of, if I choose this thing in my life, that's going to lead to me feeling better. When I do this thing, this doesn't feel good. This feels icky. Maybe I'm not going to do that. So we begin to then create our recipe for joy, recipe for pleasure, for, our well-being.
And then I think that recipe can then be applied to what goes on privately with partners or with yourself and how you have a relationship with your body. And I think it's even like you can literally translate like, oh, I like spicy things and I like moving fast and I like race cars. It probably translates into how you like to experience sex or like.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because I think what that is, it's all nervous system stuff, right? So I think so much about sexuality is learning to trust yourself, to trust that, like, if we're talking about in the bedroom, like doing this thing with this person or with myself, does this actually feel good? Or am I doing it because I saw it in a porn, or I heard that my friend is doing it, or I was told that this is what you do? Like, to really check in and be like, this is actually bringing me pleasure. I know what pleasure is, and I'm feeling pleasure right now.
Yeah. Empowering yourself.
And that's like that memory bank of like, okay, I know that eating a strawberry makes me feel pleasure. I know that dancing with my friends make me feel pleasure. I know that just sitting still or whatever, that's a memory of pleasure in my nervous system. So then when you're in the bedroom or you're interacting with somebody, if there's any confusion, do I like this? Do I not like this? You just drop into that feeling of like, oh yeah, that's pleasure. I trust that feeling.
You can be in that space, and it's a very vulnerable space to be in. So that's kind of like the anchor that you can turn to and be like, oh yes, this is good, because it can be performative. It can feel like you're doing something, and exactly that, like, oh, a previous lover, boyfriend liked this, so I'm going to do this and go through the motions and not actually even check in with the partner you're with. Like, does this feel good for them? Does this feel good for me? Or are we just doing this because this is what we've always done? Kind of thing. It just becomes a watch and repeat rather than a being in the experience and knowing what is pleasurable. And then also, that's the next phase of it, is then being able to communicate what you were saying of like the shame of it. You can be so vulnerable in sex with a partner, but then still not even be able to talk about.
Oh, totally. And we all have different associations with our sexuality and how we were raised, you know, what we were told was dirty and what was accepted in the bedroom and the exploration of that. And I think, again, it all goes back to feeling safe, trusting yourself, trusting the person you're with. You know, it all comes down to the nervous system. But like, if you feel good doing it and if the person you're with feels good doing it, then it must be good, right? It all starts getting weird and complicated and dark when there is, you know, this kind of like somebody wants to do something, you don't feel right doing it. It becomes shameful, all these things. But at the end of the day, if two people are experiencing pleasure together and they trust each other and it feels safe, then it's good.
Yeah. I've recently understood sex in a different way of like, sex is a collaboration.
Totally.
And like both people have to bring things to the table and communicate about it and kind of meet each other where you're at. I think a lot of people think that they're not compatible. And someone gave me this visual of like, it's two dials. You're a dial and your partner's a dial. And there's certain things like certain kinks, fetishes, touches, energies. And all you have to do is kind of tune in. So you don't have to be a perfect match with the partner you're with, but you have to kind of find and understand and meet each other. And sometimes some of those places you don't want to meet because like that's not your cup of tea.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And that
can change too. And I think the more comfortable you get with somebody or with the idea of something, the safer you feel, the more open and relaxed your nervous system goes. You don't go into fight or flight. You don't have this like, oh, no, that doesn't feel good. This is triggering for me. It's so important to have those boundaries. It's so important to listen to that nervous system. But then it's also like, okay, but where is this trigger coming from? Why do I have such a hard boundary around this? This does bring my partner pleasure. So where is that line between like hard boundary, no, when you know, it's like there has to be this like, okay, maybe over time, eventually I get to a place where I want to explore that. And then you might find that that's actually also very pleasurable to you. But it very much is a collaboration. It very much is a conversation of, do you feel safe? Do I feel safe? And it doesn't have to be this big conversation in the moment. It's just something that like, it happens in these subtle nervous system kind of ways where we begin to take off our armor and are open in a way that only happens through a trusting relationship. It doesn't have to mean it's a monogamous relationship. No. It doesn't have to mean that it's a long-term relationship. It's really just nervous system stuff. And that's what controls that fight or flight or that parasympathetic rest, restore, relax, enjoy, you know, response.
Yeah. I love the idea of like setting a boundary and knowing that boundaries move. It's like a moving, breathing thing.
Yeah.
And that it's not just like, oh, my partner and I discuss, we're never doing that. We don't discuss. We just put our heads in the sand and ignore it. But we know that there's a perimeter here and it's tight. It's about understanding that the boundary is something that can move and expand. And the best way to know where the boundaries are is by communicating and being like, where are you at with this now? And then also knowing that like with those boundaries creates a safe container for play, like foreplay, for playing with one another and feeling safe in that space. And then knowing like, oh yeah, right now this is where I'm comfortable, but this can completely expand or contract just like we do with our breath and our movements. That's how a relationship kind of interacts, is within those boundaries. And it's safer than not knowing, because I think that's another thing is that people don't want to talk about it and they don't actually even set a boundary, and then it's scary. It's terrifying. What's
Yeah.
happening with
And I think it's also going back to that is like when something brings you pleasure and you desire that thing, if you feel for whatever reason that thing might be too kinky or might be too scary to even like ask your partner, then that does create, again, I keep using this word, but I think we have a lot of shame around sex. And I think it does create shame. And I think that the more that we can just like honor our desires and feel safe to say, hey, like, I'm curious about this, especially in relationships where you feel like maybe your partner isn't going to be into it. It just feels nice to just say, like, actually, let's try this. How do you feel? And they might not want to do it, but they might want to do it. And I think either way, what that does is just, it takes any of this like taboo away from our sexuality, and we can just like own it and just feel fine about it and
destigmatize it.
Yeah, and it's totally okay to like have these desires. We need to honor our desires. And the more we suppress them, I think that's when like dark, weird, secretive behavior comes out.
Yeah. Withdrawing.
Yeah. And
not feeling the openness.
Being underground about it and like seeking it out in like other places where you feel safe and that other people understand you. And instead of giving your partner the benefit of the doubt, to be like, well, maybe actually that is something that they can get down with.
Right.
And, and so all of a sudden it doesn't feel so shameful, so dark. It's like, actually, this is light and exciting and expansive. And I trust my partner and I feel safe. And
we can move through this together and experience it together. And I think a lot of what happens with sex, with partnership, and especially in monogamous relationship or long-term, you start to put your partner on a pedestal, and then you start to lose that desire. In that way, it starts becoming a different thing. And I think also through parenthood or any milestones in life, it's not like you don't feel safe with that partner, because you do feel safe in so many ways, but there's something about maybe like a shadowy side of your sexuality that you don't want to reveal, because you don't want to feel rejected from this person that you've put like on this high pedestal and want to experience other parts of life with. But then you start seeking it out in other ways. And I think that, like, I love what you said of like, give your partner the benefit of the doubt to be open to it, but also give them the space to process that. Like, because some things might be like,
whoa, I didn't know you were into that. Yeah.
And it might be shocking or jarring, but it could be something where it's, oh yeah, maybe let's try this, or let's take this workshop. There's so many resources out there now that are more approachable to explore kink or other things within sex that might be intimidating for someone else. And so I also love the idea of like, what's your yuck could be someone else's yum. And so like trying not to react to anything that people find pleasurable and being like, ugh, what?
I also think it's interesting with myself when I have that response, because there are certain things that I sexually have that response to where I'm like, oh, that doesn't actually feel right for me. And it's a physical response. It has nothing to do with societal stuff. It's literally, I'll have like a physical feeling in my body around certain things. And it's like a hard no. And so I think it's cool to be able to explore that within yourself too. Like, why do I have this hard no? So not only do we understand our pleasure signals, but also what are these major turnoffs? And they all lead to a story that's going to, somewhere within us give us greater understanding to what has made us who we are through our experiences in life. And it's all stored in the nervous system, and it all comes out through what we let in and what we keep out. And so we have to, I think, pay attention to both and to know that there's a reason for both. And then they both can change.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's like fluid. Yeah.
It's ever flowing, ever moving.
Yeah.
And I love that too, of like, to know thyself is to know pleasure and also what's not pleasurable. And then that's what you can take to your partner. Because that's also the thing of like, if you don't know yourself and you don't know what's going on in your nervous system, what feels good in your experience, you can't expect someone else to then fulfill and respect those things too, because you don't know, so they don't know. So I love that the idea of self-exploration through this, uncovering, unveiling these things, and then being able to then take that information, that data to your partner.
And to know that sometimes like what felt good before maybe doesn't feel good now. And to be able to just like whatever it is, especially in the moment when it's happening, we don't have to unpack it, but we do have to trust that feeling of like, nope, this isn't right for me. And to be able to just say it. Because I feel like a lot of times, especially with like sexuality, when you're younger, when you're first exploring it, you do things that really don't feel good and you do it anyway. And that leaves an imprint, and I think that it's like to know that it's okay to say no. when it comes to sexuality. It's only for you. You need to feel good doing this. And, that was one thing that I think we all have experienced early on with sexuality, was doing things that didn't feel right because we thought we were supposed to.
Yeah, this is what I need to be doing. Or
Yeah.
This is the motions I need to go through. And I think that's so many people. I can speak for a lot of women have experienced pain in sex, never expressed it, and then thought that that's what sex was and just kind of suffered through sex. The next place I'd like to move in the conversation is because you said, oh yeah, like when you were younger, you went through these phases of sex and like certain things might feel good in one moment or in one period of your life. And all of a sudden you're like, no, this is not for me, or this isn't for me anymore because I've evolved and changed and grown. And so when you go through different phases and milestones like parenthood, and you've recently become a parent and have a beautiful child. And so what has that experience been like for you, for your relationships, your relationship with your own sexuality, as well as with partners, and that growth in that stage? Because I think a lot of people struggle. I think that's one of the biggest things.
So, I always had a healthy relationship with sex, a sexy relationship with sex. I grew up in a household where sex was talked about. Like my dad, the first time his version of like sex education was like leaving a tantric sex like VHS tape on our VCR when we were kids, and like, just, I'm going to leave this here for you guys. Just watch it, at your leisure, and kind of being like, okay, what is this? And then like when nobody was around, like slipping it in, watching it. And like, that was my dad's way of kind of teaching us that, sex is energetic, sex is connection, sex is, it's a beautiful thing. So this was something I learned early on. And not to say that I didn't have my own, confusion and questions, but I knew this other side of sex existed, that it was this kind of spiritual dropping into the breath stuff. And so early on, like I dropped into that, I was like, oh, okay. Like I understand for me what sexuality was, like flow state that I got into with whatever partner I was with. And I had an easy time with orgasm and an easy time connecting in that level. So I never really questioned that, like when I had a kid, that like that was going to shift for me. But I was aware that all my, especially female friends, after having children, that really was a huge shift that kind of confused them and was something that like they didn't really feel safe talking about with anybody else outside of other mothers. And a lot of it was like not even talked about, and a lot of shame actually. And so I kind of went in thinking like, oh, that's not ever going to be me. Like I have a really healthy relationship with my libido. And turns out that that was me. That did happen. And I had my OBGYN was a man. He was a gay man. He's wonderful. Such a great doctor. And he always kind of like talked about sex after the baby came as something that was like really important. Like he just was always nailing it in. And I'm like, okay, I get it. But like, again, I'm good. It's not going to be me. And then the morning after Silas, my son, was born, I had an emergency C-section. So I was still in the hospital. And, I had a super traumatic birth. I was like in a state of like, complete euphoria for holding my child, but also totally wrecked by
the delirium.
Yeah. And it's like 7 a.m. and he's doing his rounds, and he comes and he knocks on the door, and basically what he wanted to talk about was sex. And it's like me and my partner are like lying there like, you're bringing up sex again? Come on. Like, but really that was his thing, was like, listen, you guys are entering into parenthood for the first time. I know from experience, sex and the lack of is a huge hurdle for partners to get over. And I just want to remind you that like, try your best, to keep at it. And at the time, again, I was like, okay, but the reality is like, he's right. And it's hard. It's really, really, really hard for many reasons. But I think a big one is hormonal. Your hormones change dramatically when you are breastfeeding, when you're caring for, a baby, and you have all these shifts and changes going on in your body. transitioning from pregnancy, growing the baby, then delivering the baby, then feeding the baby. There's so much happening. And then there's also the lack of sleep and like all these things. But ultimately, I think that like we have this sex drive that comes to procreate, right? This is like not to say that that's the only reason why we have sex. 100% not. Sex is pleasure, and pleasure is something that is a gift in this life, right? But it is an evolutionary draw, right? To have this pleasure. We seek pleasure because it keeps pushing us forward, right? As human beings, and we keep evolving. And all of a sudden, you know, we have this child and we have this new baby. That sex drive isn't as important. It just isn't. Like I've made this child. And so the sex drive does begin to take the back seat. Before you have a child, so much of what you think about in relationship is sex. It's like you measure whether or not your relationship is healthy based off of like how many times a week do you have sex, or if there is like a sexual chemistry. Everything is so much about sex. And then when the baby comes, it shifts, and you measure the relationship based off of like, how are we caring for this child together? Simple things like, who's taking out the trash? Or do you come home at night? Do you make me feel safe? Like all of a sudden your measure for a healthy relationship is very different. And you're not emphasizing so much the sex part because that isn't the most important. So with all that said, there's so many things that happen in this period of time that can keep you away from actually having sex. And you lose that desire and you lose the drive. And often it comes from the woman, not so much from the man. So there can be a big disconnect. There can be this desire still that the man wants it. If you're in a, you know, heterosexual relationship, you know, I'm speaking through my experience, and then the woman maybe doesn't. And so there has to be this like time of transition where you can hold the space for the transition and you can allow for, you know, whichever partner, let's just speak for the woman, the mother, to have the time to heal, right? To have the time to have her hormones rebalance, to have the time to like get out of sleep deprivation, also to have the time to like look at your own body and feel sexy. That was a big thing. I would look down at my body and I didn't recognize it. I had these milky boobs and, you know, my vagina felt different. My body felt different. Everything just, I didn't look at myself and feel sexy. I felt beautiful. Like I just grew this baby and I felt very feminine and very beautiful, but it wasn't that sexy desire, that sexy feeling that I would feel before. So there's so much that we're coming to terms with that there needs to be a time for transition. And if you're in a partnership where your partner doesn't understand that, that becomes dark and it becomes back to that word shameful, back to that word like things that you feel something's wrong with you. And then that increases your lack of libido, increases your not wanting to engage in sex. So I think it's really about creating the space in your relationship to have a powerful pause and let that be okay. And just when we like talk about setting boundaries when we are engaging in sex, setting boundaries when maybe we're not engaging in sex, and to say like, actually, it's okay for you to say no. And it's okay for this. And I'm still going to love you and I'm still going to hold you and I'm still going to like kiss you. And it doesn't have to be sexual.
Yeah. I was going to say you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and remove intimacy. You might need a pause from sexual desire and sex drive and like engagement of physical sex.
Yeah.
But you don't have to then throw everything out.
God, that is so huge, because I think that we so much in our relationships, physical touch leads to sex.
Right.
And so much of like what I've experienced in my own relationship, but really what I've like counsel women on, and even men, like in that relationship model with, when talking about, again, heterosexual relationship, when a woman has given birth and her body is going through so much, there is that thing of like, it is so healing for the nervous system, for the trauma that the body has taken on from, you know, birth is violent.
Yeah.
It's powerful, but it's violent. And you're holding that. My body after birth was so tight. There was so much trauma I was holding in it. And all I craved was soft touch, was gentleness without having to give anything in return.
Right. Just receiving.
Just
like you were just wanting to
receiving.
receive softness.
Yes. And that's something that I have really encouraged my clients and to say like, hey, you know, I just like hold her without expecting sex. Just hold her and that's it. And that will heal the nervous system so much quicker. And through that intimacy, there's a sense of like softening and letting go. And the trauma begins to leave the body. And that's when the sexuality begins to come back online.
Because yeah, similar to what we were speaking about earlier, of like, if you don't feel safe and like childbirthing is traumatic, a powerful experience. And so that you need to then regulate and come back to your body. But it's a new body. There does need to be time to like learn and understand your body and let it repair, restore from that experience. And I think you mentioned like, oh yeah, in your friend groups and with the people you work with, it's mostly with women who have had babies. And what I hope for this podcast is that the conversation opens up to the partners, probably cisgendered men.
Yeah.
In some cases, maybe it's a lesbian relationship and like the other partner has not carried a child. And so allowing the conversation and giving permission for mothers to speak or parents to speak, and regardless of gender or regardless of who's the birthing parent or not, but being able to understand and relate to your partner and then be able to communicate about what the needs are and what the desires are, and like how do you then meet with the kind of touch that feels good. And
and it really is, and it's like interesting the more that we kind of like pull back and get this like macro view of what we're talking about. It's really like all about communication. It's all about being seen and being heard, and to know that your feelings, whatever they are okay. And that is that loving, safe, intimate environment that allows for us to then be open to experiencing. It's like, oh, okay, like I don't feel safe right now. I feel tired right now. I don't feel good. But because you're allowing me to be this way, this is changing whatever is happening inside of me. I'm feeling safe. My trauma is leaving my body. And then maybe like next week or maybe next month, but like keep the intimacy, keep holding me, keep trying, because then one day, like you're going to hold me that way. Instead of you just holding me, I'm going to reach back and I'm going to initiate and like
spark
and
like
spark, and it's going to start happening. But it's like, just holding the space for each other to be where we are and to not force, to not feel obligation, to not completely cut somebody off because they don't feel ready, to still just be there lovingly.
Don't spiral into a rejection state, because that's, I think, what happens to
that's what happens.
A lot of the partners.
And then the resentment happens. And then next thing you know, people are just going in opposite directions. And then they're seeking it out other places, and that's where the downfall begins to happen, or the disconnect, the discord.
On that topic of conversation of the parents, co-sleeping comes up in that space of like, that is a very clear disconnect in some bedrooms, and some parents don't agree on it. And there's a lot of opinions around co-sleeping and having the baby in the bed or continuing that through toddlerhood. And that, I think that for some of the partners or the childbearing partner, that is like, that's the clear, like, this is the thing. This being is now taking my spot. And rather than it being like all of these other things that we're talking about of like being comfortable in the body, but that's a very clear indicator for the partner of like, this is what's happened.
Right.
I'm sure a lot of couples therapists can say like, oh yeah, the partner mentioned the baby was in the bed and got kicked out. And I think that's a lot of people's experience. So I would love your thoughts and opinions on co-sleeping, or how, if you do it, or how you see other people in your life.
So we co-slept up until our son was like a year and a half. My thoughts and opinions on co-sleeping is, I think that it's personal, and it really comes down to what you feel most comfortable doing. And it's not only about one parent, it has to be both parents. And I think that co-sleeping only works when everybody in the bed is happy to be in the bed. Maybe not happy, but everyone wants to be there, right? If one partner is not happy in that situation and they are, resentful, then it's not working, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it really has to come down to it's a family decision. And for us, I felt very strongly about having my child in bed with me. For me, like the bonding that takes place with having baby on mama in that safe place is very important.
It'll have a lifetime benefit for your
Yeah.
child. Yeah.
For
I
me,
think
I'm
so.
like, I did not feel right having, growing my child and then having him away from me. I wanted to have him close to me. And also I had a emergency C-section and it was just easier. Like getting up with, a huge incision every, a few times a night to breastfeed was physically really hard for me. So just physically healing wise, it was easier to have Silas in bed with us. And also my partner agreed, and it was working until it wasn't, and then it stopped working. And my partner was sleeping in another room because he wasn't sleeping right, and me and Silas were just sleeping together, and then all of a sudden that started feeling like there was a discord, and then I stopped being able to sleep, and then I realized Silas wasn't even sleeping well. So it worked and then it didn't. So I think it's so personal, and some people just don't ever co-sleep, and that's what works in their family. Some people co-sleep just for the first month and then they transition. Whatever works for you.
Yeah, it's all individual. But
Yeah, totally.
How I love that, like how you communicate and then recognizing like none of us are benefiting from this and no one's happy right now. So
at all. We switched. Yeah.
Mhm.
But I'm glad I got that time in.
Mhm.
But with that, with sexuality, I think that's, probably the next question. Like, how does that?
Yeah.
So I think that like with parenthood, all things are different and you have to find other ways and other places to have sex, and again, I said, like, you're not having sex every day, so I think some people, I have no idea, but like, I don't think that is in the early months of parenthood, that's like the top priority.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't become that burdensome in that way where, you do it in the living room or, you just find ways.
As you were saying that, I'm like, it's kind of funny because when you're a teenager, you have to find ways, like
Totally.
and you're explorative and it's fun and like, oh my God, we're having sex in the backseat of the car. We're doing things. And
if you had sex as when you were a teenager.
Yeah, as a teenager or like a young adult. Let's say a young adult. When
totally.
you're first
when you're living
sex,
in your parents' home.
Yeah, when you're in places that you got creative. And so why not kind of ignite that part of you?
Yeah.
Because that's when you're first striking up, the hormones are going and you're in that place with your sex drive and wanting to explore. And so instead of it being like, oh, we have to have sex like on the couch, it's like, no, this is fun. Like, this is different. It doesn't have to be such a thing of it's a sacrifice or...
It's all how you choose to frame it.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes a burden if it's a burden. And that's why it goes back to like the co-sleeping thing. It only works if everybody is happy doing it. And if you're happy doing it, then you're going to be happy to find other places to have sex. If you're upset and you're pissed off about it and resentful, then it's going to feel that way. It's going to feel that way. And it's going to create a discord.
And then, so the last question, which is a wild card question, and kind of plays into this conversation of what's your favorite time of day to have sex? Because I've learned of that, of like, oh yeah, the time of day can affect whether you or your partner have the same time of day of enjoying sex and whether that works or not, and like how to find those right moments. And so what is your favorite time of day?
I mean, God, that's changed a lot. And now, for me, I think sex is a wild card still for me. And it really depends, not so much, and this is maybe not answering the question directly. It's not so much about the time of day. It's more about like how I feel. So I think that correlates like to whether or not I'm tired or whether or not, I've had time to like just drop down from like motherhood and working and all these things. So before, when I could choose the time of day to have sex, because I didn't have much going on, I would probably say I liked morning sex. But now my mornings start with a bang. Like, even if I wanted to have sex, doesn't mean I can. So for me, it's like when there's that quiet space, that energy for my partner and I to actually be together, where we both just are like relaxed. That's for me, I guess, how I judge.
Yeah. It's the same experience of like morning sex people are usually that, like they're just
more relaxed
and at ease. And so now it's just finding that, and especially that like not being sleep deprived, and also kind of removing some of the label work, mom, all of the labels that you're carrying and like letting those go.
Totally.
taking off those armor and then being like, okay, I can be vulnerable and at ease and comfortable in my body. And so this is the right time. So it's not actually
And that
time as we know it, but it's
yeah.
your experience. And it's the same thing of like when you're waking up, you're not all of those things. You're just you being.
Yeah. And I think that going back to like making sure you connect in that way, all of going into parenthood and what I've seen, all of my friends who had kids before me, and now what I see in my own relationship, carving out time for date night.
Yeah.
It sounds so cheesy before you have a kid because you're like, I have date nights all the time. But when you become a parent, date night is far and few between. And the couples that I see who have the most healthy relationship are the ones that make time for each other. And whenever I do that in my relationship, whether it's like a weekend, which we hardly ever get, but when we do, like you create time just to like be, you can drop back down into like, this is Kumi. This is my partner. Like, this is who I am, separate from work, separate from, family, all the things. So I think in terms of parenting, like it is actually super crucial to have date night, to take, 2 nights where you go away and like sleep somewhere else. Actually having a night where you like stay in a hotel, or if it's like a financial thing, like just stay somewhere, who knows where, that's separate from your own home. I think that's really, I found for me, like the best.
It's similar to that idea of finding creative places to have sex because that exists, and recognizing like, this can feel like young adulthood when we were exploring, but it's also when you first started dating your partner, you scheduled sex because you planned dates.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
true.
It's not like, it is funny because people are like, ooh, like that's so cheesy, or I don't want to be one of those couples schedules sex or dates.
Yeah.
And it's like, but you did.
Yeah.
For a majority of your adult life, you've scheduled
you totally
your
did.
dates.
Yeah, you're right. You never thought about it like that, but that was like what it was.
Yeah,
you were like, I'm going to go to dinner and we're going to have sex, because like that's what you do when you're in a romantic relationship.
Yeah, and you're courting each other, so you schedule it. You don't just show up at a restaurant and you're like, there you are. Okay,
or just like knock on the door and be like, although that's also really fun, spontaneous, drop-in visits.
But it is a knowing, like, you'll be home, and like, let's do that. There's a knowing of time.
Yeah, exactly.
And communication of time. And so that's a lot of people do have like an aversion to scheduling sex, but it's like, you've done it all the way up until a point, and then you move into with each other, and now it's all assumptions. And it's like, you don't have to assume, and we don't have to fall into this pattern. It's like sex can happen and be spontaneous at any time. But you can also schedule it so that it works and you maintain that connection. Or date.
And I think it's
not
like,
just sex, but like date night.
It's like setting it up for success. Yes. Like so much with parenting, like we talk about like setting up our kids for success, right? So there's like things that we can do where we know like this is actually going to like lead to a successful outcome if we, hold the space in this way, organize it in this way. And I guess that's really what it comes down to with sexuality. It's like, if you know that your partner, like, this is not going to be, you might be feeling sexy, and then you go and you try to like make a move on your partner, and you see that they're in the middle of like cleaning dishes. They like haven't showered yet. Their kids hanging on their shoulder, and then you make a pass. Most likely you're going to get rejected. And then that, so it's like that rejection begins to like make you feel less likely to then make a pass at your partner. So maybe it comes down to knowing that like we're setting ourselves up for success. You're going to walk into this feeling, sexy and, all the things. And I'm going to walk into this feeling sexy and all the things. And then we hopefully will have sex.
Yeah. Here's the boundary. And this is the container. And this is how we're bringing ourselves to this. And it's not something to be ashamed of or like embarrassed by, like, we have to do this. It's like, no, you always had to do it. Yeah. And then at some point you moved in, and then it's just like, you're here, I'm here, and this is when it happens, or it doesn't. Yeah. And instead it's like, no, you can continue to make an effort.
Oh yeah. And I think the longer you're in a relationship, if you are in a monogamous long-term relationship, the more easy it is to just kind of like slip out of, moments where you're making time in that way. Yeah. So yeah, I think that is a way to keep the spark alive.
Cool. So that's it. That's the episode. And so thank you so much for allowing me into your home and sharing this conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. And I hope that I was able to shine some light on some things for some people.
Oh, so that, yeah, one more thing. I think you definitely did shine a lot of light for a lot of people. So how do they find you and like connect with you?
Oh, well, you can always find me on Instagram. Shady Lawn is my handle with Shady, SHADYLAWN. Or you can email me at kumarawellness@gmail.com.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Special thanks to all of our guests. Head South is hosted by Kat Meyer, produced by Isis Barlow, edited by Megan Hook, with music by Lily Rezi Rothman, graphics by Ella Chodos Irvine, cover art by Gina Ship Casey, and intro by Murph Meyer.
If you're looking for